Hi, everyone, and welcome back to our online course on Western history. Today, I wanted to take a look at the Industrial Revolution. We've been talking about the political situation in Europe after the defeat of Napoleon, and I argued there that what was involved was a conflict between conservatives, that is, royalists or monarchists, and liberals. I also talked a bit about the Romantic movement, which was another interpretive paradigm for looking at the 19th century. And there is a reaction in the Romantic movement to the rationalism of the French Enlightenment. So we talked about that for a bit as well. Another important revolution came virtually on the heels of the French Revolution, and that was this Industrial Revolution. Whereas the French Revolution was one of politics, the Industrial Revolution was social and economic. It was also material. Even though people today are more into information technology than necessarily industrial technology, we still are a product of industry, and the Industrial Revolution is what made that possible. For the first time, manufactured goods would be produced and used on a really large scale. In other words, the local workshop really gave way to the industrial factory that we see today. Now, this revolution is different not only in terms of what it revolutionized, but also in the time it took to implement. When you think about it, the French Revolution took literally months to accomplish. The Industrial Revolution ultimately took decades. In fact, as I've already mentioned, there are still countries that are getting on board with the Industrial Revolution. Now, what I'd like to do in this talk is to go over a little bit about the background of the Industrial Revolution, the technological advances, expansion on the continent, and some of the social impacts of this revolution. And the time frame that we're dealing with here is England basically from the late 18th century on, and then in terms of the continent from about 1830 on. So that's the time frame that we're looking at here. So first, let's take a look at the background of the revolution. And I want to start by taking a look at England first. Now, I guess the first point that I want to make here is that there is no one factor that really explains why the Industrial Revolution happened in England first. There were a number of interrelated reasons. So, for one thing, Britain was extremely wealthy. It was more successful, really, than any other country of its time in practicing mercantilism. Now, you may remember that mercantilism was the idea that you had to have more gold and silver in your treasuries, that your exports were strong and you were essentially self-sufficient. The Brits had also experimented with new banking methods. They had a central bank, that is the Bank of England, that utilized paper money and credit to make it easier for merchants and these industrialists to get capital. They also, of course, as we've talked about before, they had colonies, and it helped that England definitely had colonies in Africa and also in the East. They also had a mobile labor force. England was relatively small, and there were a number of important rivers that really helped transportation around England. There were other reasons as well. England had a large supply of coal. It had a large supply of iron ore. These were central ingredients for the manufacturing process and would be really, really important for the Industrial Revolution. In terms of government, the government was relatively stable thanks to the Glorious Revolution. It had some level of financial stability. Basically, people had a lot of money to spend. So all these things really came together in the late 18th century. I might also mention here the agricultural revolution. This also played an important part in developing Britain's wealth. Most scholars think that the agricultural revolution preceded the Industrial Revolution, but it's important at least to appreciate it, I think, in its own right. Think about it this way. More land was cultivated than ever before. Increased yields per acre. Think about improved climate and better livestock. All of these things contributed to this increase in agricultural production. And of course, if you have an increase in agricultural production, you have more food, and you have more food with less labor. A lot of this manual labor ended up migrating to the cities where factories were founded. One of the biggest advances at the time was the new crop of alfalfa, which is a hay, a grass, and this kind of hay stored nitrogen in the roots, and it helped to fertilize the soil as well as feed livestock in the winter. So the development of alfalfa was really important in this agricultural revolution as well. There were also some important ideological changes as well that fed into this. We'll talk about this more later in a separate talk, but basically as part of the essence of nationalism that really began to emerge after the French Revolution, people became more concerned for the country as a whole and not just the individual. And one of the ideas that came out of that here was that government should stay out of the way of economic growth. So you begin to see some of these ideological shifts, and ideological shifts mean the ways in which people thought. And you see these kind of develop and change as well. I think it's important to appreciate the Industrial Revolution as a process of technological change and growth. One invention leads to another, which leads to new situations and new changes. The first stage in this series of new inventions was in the textile industry. Up until this point, textiles were a cottage industry. And by this I mean that a family or an extended family would typically make, say, 40 or 50 garments to sell to a merchant. This was the normal way of doing things. But as you can imagine, there was a limit to how much one family or even extended family could make. So they needed to come up with ways of producing these textiles faster in order to meet the growing demand. This is where something like the invention of the spinning jenny in the late 18th century was so important. This was a mechanical device that sped up the production of yarn. Instead of producing one spool of yarn at a time, the spinning jenny allowed you to do several. The water frame was another element to this. This was something that was invented a little bit later on. This used water or sometimes horsepower to spin thread, and this too vastly increased the amount of thread produced. Now, one of the problems that this new technology created was that you needed to have some capital to set this kind of machinery up. And of course, you needed to be near water to run the machines. So most of these new technologies were set up in the rural areas. This is the beginning of factories. Now, we also see the development of new ways of creating energy. The steam engine was invented more or less in the quest for a more efficient energy source. Humans and animals can only do so much. Wood, of course, was a major source of energy in this period, but England by this time was losing its forests at a very rapid rate. The one area that they hadn't tapped was coal. But the problem here was the flooding of mines. They would dig these mines below the water level, and they would flood as a result. So they started tinkering with the idea of steam engines. Now, the concept was initially invented in the early 18th century, but it was James Watt, the Scottish engineer, who made the steam engine more efficient. The story is that he was asked to repair one of the earlier models, and he discovered a way to make it work better. With the steam engine, you could pump water out of coal mines, and so you could mine iron. So steam power was fundamental to the Industrial Revolution. It was used first in the mining industry and in factories, but soon it was used for transportation, that is, in the railroads in particular. They had steam power, and now the mills could use steam rather than water to power their mills. And this meant you could build them anywhere, including the cities. But the problem was transportation. How are you going to ship your products to other districts? And this is where the railroads come in. Land transportation was slow and clumsy. Water transportation was faster and easier. Steamboats begin to emerge on the European scene in the 1820s and 1830s. Now, with the invention of the steam engine, they could replace horse-drawn trains with steam engines. And the first public railroad was established in 1830 and connected Liverpool, the city of Liverpool, to Manchester. Both of these towns were large industrial towns in England. So the railroad was an extremely important technological advancement, probably one of the most important in terms of the Industrial Revolution. Now, some people hated the railroad, believe it or not. They said that the railroads scared the horses, and some even thought that the railroads were satanic. But not everyone. The railroads brought jobs, the need for additional metals, the need for engineering and railway construction. The railroad also brought with it opportunities to travel for pleasure. And this was a real novelty. People were divided into classes, first class, second class, coach. And this was the beginning of the resort boom, this idea of going places for fun, for leisure. Now, England was one of the first nations to realize the potential of these inventions. It started with textiles, but moved into other areas. The pinnacle of all of this was in 1851 when the British held the Crystal Palace exhibition in Kensington in London. This was the first industrial fair, and it was a celebration, a big celebration of the productivity and industry of England. It had somewhere around 100,000 exhibits that displayed all the new products of the Industrial Revolution. Britain was the world's richest nation and produced over half the world's manufactured goods. So that's a little bit about England. What about industrial expansion on the continent? I noted earlier that industrial expansion on the continent took a little bit longer than it did in England. So on the continent, you have industrialization beginning somewhere around 1830 or so. So it's quite a bit later. And so some scholars have asked the question, why did it take so long to reach the European continent? So I'd mention a couple of things here. For one reason, the continent experienced war. It experienced Napoleon, for example. Europe was devastated, and money was not around. And those who had money were cautious in the context of war. Another problem was just simply technological ignorance, and in some cases a lack of natural resources. But after 1815, when Napoleon was finally defeated, industrialization did start to happen on the continent. And once it started, they actually had some advantages. They, for example, had a strong merchant tradition. They had governments that were willing to invest. Belgium, for example, seems to have been the first country where it started. And in this case, they simply stole the technology secrets from Britain. At first, England had made it illegal for people skilled in these trades to leave the country and to export any of the devices. But a couple of engineers slipped out of the country and went to Belgium and built textile mills on water and steam power. And Belgium gave money to this and even built a state-owned railroad. There was this kind of nationalist air about the whole thing. They wanted to, in a sense, stiff it to the English. But there were some differences between the continental and British systems of industrialization. For one thing was the use of tariffs. One of the ways that countries on the continent protected their new industries was the use of tariffs. In Germany, for example, it was legal for German goods to pass all around, but they taxed heavily any foreign imports. These tariffs were a really important factor in this. After Belgium and Germany, other countries stepped up, including the U.S. and France. It is a classic case where things like geography, think about rivers or natural resources, and urbanization, that is, big cities that provide labor, these were some of the things that influenced the industrial process on the continent. Now, you want to take a look at this map very briefly here. This map shows the industrialization of Europe up to about 1850. And I want you to notice in particular those countries that still had serfs, the ones that are sort of in a reddish tint here. These were the places that did not industrialize as quickly. So the places that still had serfs, still had a lot of labor, did not industrialize as quickly as the other places. Now, let me mention a little something here about society and the Industrial Revolution. One of the important questions that has been discussed by historians ever since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution was, is this something that was good or bad for society? Now, from one perspective, there were great increases in wealth and production, but there was also a huge increase in population. Between, say, 1800 and 1851, population in Europe went from about 187 million to about 266 million people, almost double. So how do you cope with this rising population? Countries that did not industrialize, like, for example, Ireland, were really hurt during the potato failure in 1845. Ireland had a huge population burst, but they were dependent entirely on the potato crop. And what happened, of course, as you probably know, around 1.5 million people died of starvation, and there was a huge immigration to the U.S. as a result. So this question as to whether or not industrialization was good or bad for society is a really interesting one, and it's also a complex one. You have to think about this. People lived under horrible conditions. Just imagine if you've ever had a bad job when you were in high school, just multiply that by about 100 and you get some idea as to what's going on here. One of the early problems was simply getting workers. In the beginning, no one wanted to work in these horrible places. So they used child labor from orphanages. You'll remember Charles Dickens wrote a lot about this in the 1850s. Children could spin wool more easily because of their small fingers. They could pull coal from mines through smaller shafts. Statistics show that by 1830 or so, women and children made up over 2/3 of the cotton industry's labor. As time went on, laws were passed to protect the orphans and other children. But now whole families went to work at these places. In a very real and sober way, the creation of factories changed drastically the way people worked and lived. People lived in slums in the city where sanitary conditions must have been miserable. Everyone would have to come together in one location. They would work for 14 or 18-hour days, 6 days a week. It was monotonous. It was noisy. It was very, very difficult. There was no protection. People got hurt all the time. There were stories of children who lost fingers in these machines. They were just miserable conditions in which to work. The problem was that they needed everyone in the family to work in order to pay the bills. So you can imagine how difficult this must have been. Now, there were a number of people who started criticizing this and calling for reform. Some people were worried about overpopulation. Thomas Malthus wrote a book called The Principles of Population, and he basically said that population, if it's unchecked, will always outstrip the food supply and lead to things like starvation. It's what we refer to today as a Malthusian crisis. He said that the only way to correct this was to stop having babies. But he also recognized that there was no way people were going to do this. So the result was that things like plagues and war and famine, disease, were all kind of necessary checks to this population growth. Now, the problem with Malthus's ideas was that it tended to justify the harsh policies of the industrialists. David Ricardo, a British economist, picked up on some of the views of Malthus, and he came up with what was referred to as the iron law of wages. He said that someone's paycheck should always remain just above subsistence level. If you raise wages too much, then you encourage the Malthusian cycle. Higher wages creates larger families, which lead to starvation, etc. So Ricardo's view did not allow for the possibility of social improvement. Both of these views, by the way, Ricardo's views and Malthus's views, were pessimistic views about society. There were others who criticized the Industrial Revolution. Friedrich Engels was one. In 1844, he wrote a book called The Conditions of the Working Class in England. His family was an industrialist family, and he was the son of a wealthy German cotton manufacturer. But his father had some factories in England, and so Engels spent many years of his life in England. He wrote, "At the bar of world opinion, I charge the English middle class with mass murder, wholesale robbery, and all the other crimes in the calendar." And of course, it was Engels that would get together with Marx and write the Communist Manifesto. So you can imagine that there was a tremendous class division that began to develop as a result of all of this. If there's one thing that historians agree on, it's that the Industrial Revolution created a huge division between the classes. And you may remember, we understand classes today as things are defined by wealth, as opposed to your status in life or your state in life. Classes are defined by wealth. This is what Marx would later call class consciousness. Now, as the class consciousness increased, particularly the vast gulf between the rich and the poor, there were attempts made to organize labor and try and make things better. This was the beginning of the labor movement. Now, early on, it was illegal. The unions had no protection. But over time, these groups got more organized and more conservative. The trade unions by the early 1800s were even willing to strike. So Parliament eventually was forced to accept these unions. The Luddites were a small group of skilled craftsmen that started to attack the machines that threatened their jobs. When you hear someone being called a Luddite, it's this reaction toward these technological and industrial advancements. The Chartist movement took things even further. This was a movement to achieve universal male suffrage. Remember that it wasn't until the mid-19th century that men could vote, women in the 20th century. So the Chartists were radical. It was a long time before this would happen, but they did have success with the trade unions. You also see efforts to reform working conditions. There were a series of factory acts that were passed between 1802 and 1819. They realized that they couldn't have small children doing the kind of jobs that they had been doing, particularly children under the age of 9. And even with adolescents, they couldn't work long hours, only 8-hour days. And they had to get an education. So they arranged it so women would not work in the coal mines. And over time, women were working less and less in the factories, usually roughly 10 hours a day. A lot of feminist scholars say that men were overloading it, but other reports say that women welcomed this because it's the first time that they could manage their family. So as we think about things happening in the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution was certainly one of the most important paradigmatic shifts to take place in this period. It's not unlike the kinds of shifts that we see in the 20th century with the technological advances, with the internet, with the supercomputer, with the microchip, and things like that. These technologies truly did revolutionize the way people worked. They also revolutionized the way people lived. So if you have any questions or thoughts or comments, I hope you'll post them to the Slack channel. Thanks for listening, and I look forward to talking with you next time.